Hello and welcome. It's time for French Politics here on France 24. I'm Mark Perlman.
And I'm Molly Hall. Thanks for joining us. Coming up in today's show, Emmanuel Macron hits the ground running as the president eyes explosive labor reform.
James Creedon joins us to talk about the new president's awkward first steps with the media.
And France's best-known environmentalist enters the government, but will Nicolas Hulot last in politics? That's up next in the Political Brief.
The mother of all reforms, Emmanuel Macron has vowed to reform France's labor law. The president says it's a must to fight unemployment. However, the unions are warning this could ignite mass protests and strikes.
Emmanuel Macron promised to reform France's labor laws, but it's gearing up to be yet another tug-of-war between workers' unions and employers. He's looking to make French businesses more flexible, while providing greater opportunities for negotiation within the companies themselves. French employers seem pleased and eager to get started.
Businesses have been waiting for this. We need to make sure these reforms are in place as soon as possible. We're seeing a return of growth, so we've got to make the most of this upswing by having the flexible labor laws that companies are asking for.
A year ago, the last attempt to change labor laws sparked mass strikes and a 5-month-long standoff between government and protesters. The stalemate ended with a watered-down bill that neither side was truly enthusiastic about. To avoid this, Macron wants to act fast. He intends to pass his reform by executive order, a move which has unions up in arms. They see this as a direct provocation.
What happened last year is still fresh in everyone's minds. So if the government wants to push through their reforms by force, or if they don't take our demands into consideration, then of course there's going to be some anger and maybe demonstrations.
In a country where job security is almost sacrosanct, Macron will have to perform quite the balancing act to fulfill this campaign promise.
Well, now this week, the president met with all the major unions, and this is what the boss of the hardline CGT had to say afterwards.
He seemed to understand. We'll see, but the schedule might have changed.
The third round of the presidential election. This is how the upcoming parliamentary elections are often described. If Emmanuel Macron wants to push through his reform, he desperately needs a majority in those elections set for June 11 and 18.
Yes, indeed, Mark. And let's take a look then at where the polls currently stand. They show Macron is likely to get what he needs. His République en Marche party is ahead of the opposition Conservatives and the far-right National Front. We see the far left would come in fourth. Now, obviously, these polls should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, as we have 577 seats, and national projections are not always reliable.
So with those polls showing Macron's party in the lead, leaders of the oppositions are all but already admitting defeat.
Emmanuel Macron will have a majority in parliament because members of Les Républicains are shamelessly selling themselves. Even those who haven't yet joined his camp, more than 180 already back him. They've said that they're willing to work with him. They have the same project for France. This is why I'm telling the French people that if they want to make sure that their MPs have their best interests at heart, if they oppose the most destructive parts of Mr. Macron's program, they must vote for candidates of the National Front.
I can see that there are people who want to transform these parliamentary elections into a huge plebiscite to crown the new power. We would be summoned to bow to them, to applaud the master of the palace, to apply a project that is not ours. In other words, summoned to give up what we are.
Well, one of Emmanuel Macron's priorities will be to clean up the act when it comes to French politics. He's promising a bill that will block office holders from conflicts of interest, nepotism, and other ethical issues that have angered voters.
French trust in their politicians is at a record low. But newly elected President Emmanuel Macron believes he can turn the tide with a new law intended to moralize public life. The bill targets 4 areas of reform: nepotism, term limits, conflicts of interest, and criminal records. Currently, over 1 in 6 MPs employs a member of their family. After a campaign marred by fake job allegations against Conservative candidate François Fillon and his family, this bill hopes to tackle nepotism head-on.
We will carry forth a reform which will forbid the hiring of relatives or family members.
Macron intends to set the consecutive term limits at 3. This in a parliament where some members have been in office for nearly 4 decades, enjoying tax exemptions and inflated pensions, which the president also plans to axe. In order to reduce possible conflicts of interest, lawmakers would no longer be allowed to hold paid consulting jobs throughout the duration of their mandate. And in a final effort to ensure elected officials are beyond reproach, Macron's reform would require candidates for public office to have completely clean criminal records. Perhaps another nod to the several candidates who are under investigation during the presidential campaign. By the end of June, France will have a new parliament. It now remains to be seen if they will vote in a law that some argue would curtail their staying power and sources of income.
Well, just 2 weeks on the job, and one issue that's come up is the relationship the president has with media. Over 20 of France's top media outlets have written an open letter to Macron after his team imposed restrictions on which journalists could travel with him on his first trip to West Africa. Now, for more on this, we're joined by France 24's media editor, James Creedon. James, walk us through, why are we seeing the French press unhappy now?
Well, they're unhappy because the Élysée Palace essentially said that they want to pick which journalists in each newsroom or each news channel come on the official trip to Mali. That's the major sore point. And an open letter has been published, 15 different newsrooms signing that letter saying the president doesn't get to pick which journalists follow him. That's for the newsrooms to decide. The second issue that bothered them is the press were evicted from the courtyard of the Élysée Palace for the first cabinet meeting. Usually they get to take a photo and or ask questions of the ministers. This time they were asked not to be there so that the official photo could be taken, but that was just a once-off. So that's what's bothering journalists. And essentially the Élysée Palace has said, look, this is just what we're trying to do here is avoid pointless constant chattering, feeding that chattering. Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, spoke to a Sunday newspaper explaining that they don't want to feed this sort of pointless chattering. I think they're trying to avoid the mistakes made by the Nicolas Sarkozy presidency and François Hollande's presidency, where there was an attempt at transparency, but in fact it fed pointless buzz. And there was even a book written by François Hollande where some criticised that book, saying he was almost like the columnist, the news columnist of his own presidency, giving far too much information and transparency, which actually fed, I suppose, a feeding frenzy, a press feeding frenzy.
Some are actually saying that it's not such a big deal, that the media could do something else rather than follow the president around.
That's right. In fact, some saying, look, at these media moments where you have, 50 political journalists for different newsrooms or whatever, all following the same president or the same minister, don't actually provide any journalistic scoops whatsoever. And journalists would be better off spending their time doing real journalism, investigative journalism, as opposed to expecting to be invited along to these very, I suppose, tightly controlled communication events. This image actually sums up what a lot of people are saying political journalists should avoid. It was a notorious incident in 2007 when the press were packed onto a tractor following Nicolas Sarkozy. Doesn't happen very often. It's an extreme example, perhaps, but some saying, look, journalists should just do real journalism and not worry about being invited along to communications events, essentially.
All right, James, thank you very much for a look at that. Well, now, with the presence of a prime minister and 2 ministers from the opposition Conservative Party, Macron's government breaks the norms. But one of the biggest surprises is Ecology Minister Nicolas Hulot, France's most famous environmentalist.
The eco-warrior who turned down cabinet positions from 3 different presidents has just been named as France's new environment minister. Nicolas Hulot is somewhat of a superstar in France. He traveled the world producing documentaries on the impact of man on nature, advocating for the protection of fragile ecosystems. Emmanuel Macron and his new minister are sure to butt heads on several key issues, but Hulot seems confident he can reconcile his views with the president's agenda.
Am I just going to be the token environmentalist in a government that won't take my recommendations? I have a feeling that the President and the Prime Minister are going to help me with my mission.
A first point of contention, the construction of an airport in the west of the country that sparked protests from environmental activists. Hulot publicly came out against the project, while Macron advocates bringing in a mediator to find an agreement that'll please both sides. Concerning France's heavy reliance on nuclear energy, Macron wants to continue his predecessor's plan to reduce dependence to 50% by 2025 and appears in no rush to accelerate this transition. Since the Fukushima meltdown in 2011, Hulot has been fervently against nuclear power, but he declared he would align with the president's position. The pair also agree on the need to combat diesel emissions through tax breaks for less polluting engines. Nicolas Hulot consistently ranks amongst the most beloved French celebrities, but going from eco-warrior to minister might cut short his popularity streak.
Well, Molly, President Macron has said very little about protecting the environment during his campaign, and his Prime Minister, Édouard Philippe, actually worked 3 years for the nuclear giant Areva. Some say Hulot's appointment is an attempt to greenwash the president's image, and that partnership won't last.
I still respect Mr. Hulot, who I know very well. I think he's like everybody else. There are moments in life where you wonder about your role, how to be the most useful. Me, I've decided to leave the old world to do something else. But for him, I believe that in 6 months he will leave, if it lasts 6 months.
We'll see if in 6 months Nicolas Hulot is still in the government. This brings us to the end of our program. Thanks again for joining us.
Yes, indeed. Now we'll leave you with images from the president's first trip to Mali, and we'll see you next week on The Political Brief.